postvention. And it's kind of an interesting made-up word. The word was made up by this fellow Edwin Schneidman, who was one of the original founders of the American Association on Suicidology. Someone who really devoted his life to doing work on suicide prevention. So in the field, there's prevention, obviously to try to avoid tragedies. Intervention, how to help people who are in crisis. And then the idea of postvention, after there's been a death by suicide, how can we help people who are left behind? And it was Schneidman who actually said good postvention really becomes prevention, because what we're trying to do is, in his words, prevent the next, or paraphrasing, to try to prevent the next generation of suicide loss. So when we think about postvention in a school setting, what that is about is, well, there are a number of goals to that. One is just really trying to promote healthy grieving, to provide comfort, to help young people with the grieving process. You know, in some communities, we would hope young people haven't had many losses. Certainly some communities, they've had many tragedies, but you know, how can we just help them get through that process of doing the grieving in as healthy a way as possible? When we're doing the work, one of the other goals is really just how do we sort of stabilize the environment, get some equilibrium back. You know, ultimately, we want schools to get back to the business of educating kids and helping them continue to develop. But you know, if there's been a loss or a tragedy like that, that the learning's just not going to happen. We really want to try to pave the way to help them get stabilized and get back to their business of learning as soon as possible. We want to provide comfort, but we also want to avoid the risk of contagion, of some potential future suicide loss. When I use that word contagion, what that refers to is what we see occasionally, and some of the research on this has said that probably somewhere between 2 and 5% of suicide among adolescents is clearly connected to the loss of another young person that they may have heard about, known about, someone in their community, their social network. We used to think just locally in the community, but now with all this connection to people online, you know, that the world is expanding, so we know that there's exposure to hearing about and seeing about other deaths too. And I guess we think of it as a social modeling phenomena, that maybe for someone who's vulnerable, who's never even thought about suicide perhaps, when they see a model of somebody else who's coped with their problems in this way, it might increase the risk for someone. So part of good postvention is making sure we're attending to the possibility, the risk of contagion, of future deaths. So there are a number of principles we're thinking about when we're doing postvention work, and that's there's been some research by David Brent and his colleagues out of the University of Pittsburgh that's looked at how young people, how adolescents react after any kind of death of a peer, but in particular suicide was part of what they looked at. And his work looked at students 6 months, 12 months, 18 months out, and followed them over time and found increased rates of depression, increased rates of complicated grief, increased rates of anxiety, PTSD, and thinking about suicide, as well as occasionally increases in suicide attempts. In fact, his research showed that after a suicide death, there was about a five-fold increase in thinking about suicide among students. So we really want to be, within our schools, really trying to identify who are the kids, the students who might be vulnerable, and keeping an eye on them, making sure somebody's checking in with them, and maybe even considering working with an outside agency or some other groups who have some expertise in this, and starting to do some screening of youth. We certainly recommend that if there have been 2 or more tragedies. We really want everyone, not just young people, we want everyone to understand that there's never a single cause for suicide. It's complicated. It's a perfect storm, if you will, of lots of tough things coming together. And as you've been hearing through this training, we really assume from the research, what we know is about 90% of people who die of suicide have some underlying mental health challenge going on. And we want people to understand that it's not, that maybe there were some tipping points, something that happened that really pushed someone. That breakup, the not getting into the school they wanted, the bullying, or some event might be the precipitant. But there's almost always, if you really dig down, a whole bunch of other stuff that's come together that's increased their vulnerability to begin with. So we want to make sure that we don't oversimplify, we don't want to romanticize in any way or glorify in any way the loss. We want to really discourage a focus a lot of times on the actual method of how the person died. People, kids, everyone wants to know. It's part of, I think, our way of trying to protect ourselves and the people we care about. If only we understood more about, how did this happen, what did they do, we might be able to prevent some future loss. But the research also shows us that overly focusing on the methods of suicide could actually increase risk for someone who is vulnerable or at risk themselves. So kids are going to ask us. Kids ask all the time, what did he do? I heard he or she did this or that. And often the best thing to do is just acknowledge very simply, yes, I heard that this was the cause of death. But you know what? It's probably more important for us to focus on what this loss means to us and how we can prevent things like this from having to happen to other people, to really shift it back to the focus on the loss and prevention. And a big part of postvention really is trying to make that shift to prevention. How can we take the energy of this horrible tragedy and the sadness that people are feeling and help them harness that and use the energy they have in some productive way? And typically what we're doing is trying to help communities, to help schools to invest effort and energy into preventing future losses by really embarking on some prevention projects or programs. This gets into a whole issue on memorials and memorializing. Students often, just out of their caring, want to get into creating some kind of memorial. And there's some debates in our field back and forth about whether memorials should be encouraged or allowed or discouraged. I'd say best practice is generally that we try to discourage permanent memorials, the plaques, the tree, the benches, the quilts, and things like that are out there. Because again, we worry about the potential risk for someone else who might be vulnerable. Seeing in some way that maybe misinterpreting that in some way that the person's death is being celebrated in some way. So what we usually recommend is people take that energy, which is a natural part of our way of grieving, is to try to do something to memorialize the person, but to really take it and think about, are there ways to invest in avoiding future problems, to invest in stigma reduction efforts, to help raise funds for one of the suicide prevention programs in the community, to launch a suicide prevention program together that students could get on board with? Can they raise funds to buy books for the school library or the local library on understanding mental illness and depression? And can they become part of a program with their community to get community leaders involved in trying to think about how to promote mental health wellness? So to really harness and invest that energy as part of a good postvention program. Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge, for educators to acknowledge that they're impacted as well. This is hard for all of us. Schools have got to come together, give the teachers, the staff, the personnel opportunity to talk about their own reactions. We encourage, if they feel like they can do it, to talk about it with their students, to allow the students to talk about it, to recognize that the students are going to be distracted, that they're going to be having trouble concentrating, that this is going to take over their thinking for a period of time. And also to allow themselves to be human. Teachers often say to us, what if I start to cry? And our answer to that often is, good, your students will see that you're human and you have feelings and compassion, and you're modeling what grieving is about, and not to hesitate to ask for support. We think students in every school should be getting good suicide prevention curricula. There are a number of good evidence-based curricula out there. It's information available in the Suicide Prevention Resource Center's Best Practices Registry. I would encourage people to look at that. If you don't have a program now, do some research. Look at several of them. Figure out which one feels like a best fit for your school. That's in terms of prevention, but in terms of crisis planning, it's really important for schools to have a plan. You don't want to start creating a plan once there's a crisis. So hopefully most schools have some kind of crisis plan in place for a whole wide range of issues that could confront a school. But make sure you have a good crisis plan in advance, so if at all possible you know what to do. You've got it written out so you can start following a plan when an event happens. It's also good to partner with outside agencies, local mental health resources, find out from the Department of Public Health who are some of the local providers they have in your area or your region that can help support both suicide prevention and postvention. And plan, make sure there's a good plan. And plans that have guidelines that would be consistent across any kind of student loss. We want to make sure that how we respond as a school, as a community, is the same after a suicide death as if it was a homicide or a tragic medical loss or an accident. We want to make sure that the reactions are consistent so that there's no adverse impact on families or friends after a loss. We're lucky to be here in Massachusetts, where the Department of Public Health, through their suicide prevention program, actually funds suicide postvention programs. And so there are supports available to schools throughout the Commonwealth at no charge to help after a tragedy like this. Hopefully nobody ever has to call for it, but it's helpful for schools to know that there are resources out there. And actually, you'll want to be sure to check your resource list, because there are a number of really good tools out there: postvention guidelines, national toolkit, postvention toolkit that's available online that has a lot of really good resources that you can just really follow, scripts even to follow on the letters that you're going to be sending out and how to communicate well with students and families. A lot of good material out there, so look for the resource section on that.